only be able to do the right side.
I'm going to fix you now.
I'm recording.
Hi, we're recording. Welcome to period 4. Let's hope that Josh is not the only person that's not here that's actually watching these. Let's hope that we have some other students. But thank you, Josh. We're very grateful that you're tuning in. Period 4, I just want to map out. So period 4 has a definite starting and finishing date. And let me show you why it is those two dates. 1800 is the starting date because of the election of Jefferson and that dispute with Aaron Burr. The election of Jefferson, which shifts politics from the Federalists to what we call the Age of Jefferson or the Jeffersonian Dynasty, which is 24 years, almost a quarter of a century of Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. And those are the 3 Democrat-Republican presidents from Virginia. And so it's sort of the end of the Federalists. That's why 1800 is the starting year. It's a dramatic shift in control. What are characteristics of Jefferson? We'll talk about that in a minute. 1848 is the finishing year because 1848 is the beginning, really. It's the beginning of the steps to Civil War. Beginning of the steps to Civil War, 1848. It is the year of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the Mexican War land in the West, and the issue starts to be what's going to happen with the land in the West with slavery. So everything that happens in between is bulleted on this through topics. So I'm just going to jump topic to topic right now. I'm only going to talk about things that I think are really important. What I'm using, and you can get this, is this College Board's release of period 4 review. So let's start with the West. Okay, so when Jefferson purchases Louisiana, he sends Lewis and Clark and their American Indian Guide to Tecumseh to explore the West. I wouldn't worry about anything else on there. William Henry Harrison and Old Tippecanoe, that's War of 1812 stuff. Let's talk about the Supreme Court. This is really important. I know from Kahoot that nobody remembers this. There's a case called Marbury versus Madison. (1803). And the case deals with the concept of judicial review. Let me explain what this means and why this case is so important. This case is important because the case itself doesn't matter. What matters is that Marshall gave the judicial branch as much power as the other two. The judicial branch, when it was written, I don't have a copy of the Constitution in front of me, but when it was written, it was really short. Marshall said that essentially through this elaborate decision with midnight judges, Marshall said that the court had the right to review if a law was constitutional. So that's really important if you want to star the things on here that are important. This Marbury versus Madison is super important because it made every other decision matter. It gave the court teeth. It gave the court teeth. Those other italics cases on there, Fletcher Peck, McCulloch, Maryland, Dartmouth College Woodward, and Gibbons Ogden. Each of them deals with a constant theme that you need to know, and you can write this in brackets next to it. They all are examples. They all are examples of federal government. Remember, Marshall is a Federalist on the bench. Federal government power over state power. So remember federalism? We talked about what was federal and state. Well, these cases, all these Marshall Court cases are federal over state power. Okay? Hi, Mr. Cardinal.
Mr. Cardinelli.
I don't ask. Any questions about that? So as far as Supreme Court, that's what I would know about that. I'm going to jump because these are not in order. And I want to talk about the middle column, war. And I want to just go through certain things you need to know and then other things you don't. The good news is it's all in chronological order here. So let's climb through it. Napoleon owns France. The pirates were having Barbary pirate wars. We're having issues with neutrality, impressment of our sailors. Britain and France are treating us like crap. It leads to Britain blowing up our ship, which leads to Thomas Jefferson's Embargo Act. The Embargo Act said that our American merchants in 1807, our merchants could no longer trade with these European countries because it was like causing us to not have, the protection on the sea. So he was like, let's just have a trade embargo with these European countries. What ended up happening is New England merchants were like, we have to trade with these countries, we need to do business. And so they ended up rescinding the Embargo Act and coming up with the Non-Intercourse Act that says, okay, you can trade with everyone except Britain and France. But then they were like, wait, but Britain and France are our best foreign customers. So then they came up with Macon's Bill number 2 that said, okay, you can trade with one of those two countries, whatever one starts not disrespecting us on sea. And so Napoleon is the one that said, I'll take that deal, but he still continued to disrespect us. Ultimately, the War of 1812 and everything under here from War of 1812 down are the little details and nuances of the war. But just know that the war was because of frontier pressures, fighting against American Indians, disrespect on the sea by Britain. So the war was fought, the War of 1812, which was actually 1812 to 1814, was us, the U.S. versus Britain and some American Indians. We did not lose. We did not win either. We wanted to take Canada. That never happened. The White House got burned and we wrote the Star Spangled Banner, but we did not lose. In fact, we proved that we had a Navy, which was important. A lot of those terms that are on this list, like Oliver Hazard Perry and the Battle of Lake Erie, are naval battles. William Henry Harrison and most notably Andrew Jackson emerged as heroes in the most significant battle, the Battle of New Orleans, was fought after the war ended because there was no communication. The Treaty of Ghent that ended the war was in Belgium, and the war was not a loss for us, and that's important. Going to the one below it, Foreign Affairs, I just want to draw this. We colored an expansion map right around Thanksgiving. I don't know if you remember, but we colored an expansion map of the United States. Do you remember that it was the only time we colored all year? And we colored the land that we got from Louisiana in 1803, and you don't have to write all this, in the original United States, in the Treaty of Paris, and that was up into the Mississippi River, and we colored all that in. And then we got Florida, when Jackson went in there and bullied it, and we ended up with the Adams-Onis Treaty. We got Texas in 1845. The Alamo was in 1836. This was the Mexican War, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848. Oregon Purchase. So I don't remember all this. And the whole Maine, this top of Maine and top of, this was a treaty with Britain. So there's these different treaties. This was a treaty with Spain. The Gadsden purchased this little sliver in 1853 to build a railroad. We purchased from Mexico. This was from Mexico. This was with Britain. You don't need to know it in that great a detail, but this land up here was the Rush-Bagot Agreement. That's on the under Foreign Affairs. The Adams-Onis Treaty is how we got Florida. And this talks about the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine is the rest of this hemisphere, Central and South America, where we tell Europe what? You stay where?
In your hemisphere, we'll stay in ours.
You stay in your hemisphere, we'll stay in ours, and that's in 1823, and that's in that second little grouping there. Don't worry about Stephen Decatur.
Did you ever mention him?
Doesn't need to be. Don't know why he's on the list.
Did you even?
Won't be on the test.
Did you ever mention him though?
Doesn't need to be. No, not in the curriculum. Not sure why he's on here. Before I get into slavery and Jackson, which are the other two themes, I just want to jump around here. Okay, so let's talk about over to industry. Can we go over to that one? The last one on the, I'm sorry I'm jumping around, but these aren't in chronological order. So let's talk about industry. First of all, Henry Clay, the war hawk from the West, never to become president, gives us the American system in this period of nationalism. And a lot of kids didn't know this from Kahoot. This is Clay's American system. And it's another national bank. Feels like a Hamilton thing here. Tariffs and internal improvements like roads and bridges. This is a way to make the USA, this is a USA thing. This is a period of nationalism. But really, this makes the North and the West happy, but the South is starting to feel isolated. And this is the beginning of sectionalism. Sectionalism is putting your region of the country over the country as a whole. So your region. So this is the beginning of like the seeds of civil war. And what we see here is we see a couple revolutions in terms of transportation and marketplace in this industry thing. So let's talk about both of them. Transportation and marketplace. First of all, the transportation revolution of the 1820s sees dramatic change, rapid change, sees rapid change in how we move, how efficiently we move. Steam power allows ships to go against the current. The first steam engine is Robert Fulton's Claremont. Roads, like the National Road, cutting through the Appalachian Mountains, the Cumberland Gap, start to help us connect more to moving westward as well. Canals, most notably the one that runs right through our community, the Erie Canal, which connects really, the Atlantic Ocean with the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River, but ultimately New York City up to Albany and Albany to Buffalo is the actual canal. And then lastly, the beginning of railroads, which will get far more popular in the later 1800s and the mid 1800s. But these are all really 1820s, a little bit before we see changes in transportation. What this leads to is dramatic changes in the marketplace. Let me show you what I mean. The marketplace. So the transportation revolution leads to a market revolution. And that is a revolution in how we have factories that make products and how we ship products, and the change in how our country's economy works. Instead of you just having a farm to be self-sufficient or making your own clothes, items start to get mass produced. Farms start to make products to sell to places beyond their own people. And this is a change in really our marketplace, if you will. What happens is there's a factory system that comes from England. We have factories locally like Tessie or Welch Allen. These factories, it's the same concept. And we see like textile mills growing, like the Lowell, I'm in this industry box. Specialization, it's even the beginning of labor unions because of all this. So inventions like Eli Whitney's interchangeable parts, farming obviously grows. This is John Deere and the steel plow and Cyrus McCormick and the reaper, but we see big changes in industry. This is not the Industrial Revolution, that's in period 5. In period 6, actually. It's post-Civil War, it's like late 1800s. But this is sort of the pre-Industrial Revolution. It's the transportation and market revolution and the beginning of the American factory. Okay? Any questions? The box under it talks about sectionalism and gets into detail about like what life was like in all the different regions. Even talking about free blacks in the north and poor white trash, as they were called in the south, and the American Indian removal, the conflict with natives, sent out to the Oklahoma Territory, and it gets into like the nativists, the Know-Nothing Party, the planter class of the South, which was just a few wealthy slave owners. So that's the identities and conflict portion. Okay? Let's go over to the one that's third on the left that says urban growth. So this is going to talk about cities that are growing, particularly because of the Erie Canal. Where we see cities growing, ready for this? We see cities growing because of the transportation and market revolution. We see cities growing in places like Rochester, Syracuse, Albany, Buffalo, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Ohio, Detroit, Michigan, Chicago, Illinois, St. Louis, Missouri. A lot of these cities on water that are canal connected start to grow in what we now call the Midwest, that was called the Old Northwest. And so we see urbanization, we see new cities springing up. In the cities, particularly Boston and New York, we start to see the first Roman Catholics cluster there, particularly because of the Irish potato famine in the 1840s. The Irish went to Boston and New York City. They were Roman Catholics, so we see a little bit of change in urbanization. We start to see German immigrants coming here as well. This is where kindergarten comes from. It says Tammany Hall. These are the big city bosses that ran New York City in this era. Okay, it mentioned slavery here. Cotton's king. That little box is important. It's setting up for the Civil War. It talks about, Eli Whitney's cotton gin and how that changes. The South, slavery becomes more of a cotton thing than it used to be for tobacco. And it moves. Okay. Let's do now together Jacksonian politics, economics, common man. You can bracket these three together. Jacksonian politics, economics, and the common man. Those are all really the same era. And that's the age of Jackson. If you want to circle those, so it looked like something like this. This is age of Jackson, the way this is clustered, okay? It talks about Jacksonian democracy, which is an essay that you've written for me already. And that is discussing, that's a couple pages from period 4 that get into Andrew Jackson and how democracy changed drastically. He used the popular campaigning that we see today. He rewarded his friends with all the jobs. He threw out all John Quincy Adams. That's called the spoils system. We start to see the two-party system reestablished, the beginning of the modern Democrats. Jackson gets thrusted into the presidency because of the corrupt bargain. Let's talk about that for a second. It's important. 1824 election is important. The election of 1824, we are a one-party, the Federalists are dead, we are a one-party country for really the only time in our history, and Jackson gets the most electoral votes and the most popular votes. Second place is John Quincy Adams. A couple other candidates behind: Henry Clay, Crawford, Calhoun. Why would Adams become the president? Well, because Jackson didn't get one more than half of the electoral votes, so the House of Representatives picks the president by constitutional rule. Clay throws his support to John Quincy Adams. He becomes president. Jackson gets screwed over, even though he's the rightful choice of the people, and they call it the corrupt bargain. The election of 1824 is the corrupt bargain because Henry Clay gets to be Secretary of State for John Quincy Adams. And the Jacksonians are feeling really angry and left out. And it's a demographic that's very similar to maybe like the type of people that got excited about Trump, that weren't really into politics before. So what we see is a dramatic change in our country. Now, granted, it's not women and it's not minorities, but we do see a change that all white men, even non-property owner white men, are becoming involved in politics. And from this election of 1824 to the election of 1840, just 16 years later, 7 times more people voted. Holy crap. That's the impact of Andrew Jackson and Jacksonian democracy. 7 times more people voted in a 16-year span because Jackson appealed to, and there's even its own little section here, the common man. Universal white male suffrage, conventions picking candidates. Jackson appealed not just to political elites, but to the common man. That's the real revolution of 1828 when Jackson becomes a 2-term president in the age of Jackson. It's sort of the fallout from this corrupt bargain. Now, Jackson as a governor, or as a leader, as someone that governs, as a president, has tons of conflicts under Jacksonian politics. The Tariff of Abominations, he threatened South Carolina he'd send force in. He stuck up with Peggy, who was called promiscuous, for lack of a better word, and that made a lot of the wives of the other husbands in his cabinet angry. He didn't even listen to his own cabinet. He listened to what they called the kitchen cabinet. Calhoun's his enemy from the South. It was his friend and vice president. And really what we see is a 2-party system reemerges. At this point, it'll be Democrats, which are Jackson, and the Whigs is the other party. The Whigs are born in the 1830s as a response to Jackson, and they die over the slavery issue. They're only a major political party for about 30 years. And really, the views of these parties are very similar to the old Democrat, Republicans, and Federalists, if we're going to be honest. Jackson had problems with the National Bank. He fought with Nicholas Biddle. He had problems with Roger B. he liked Roger B. Taney. He had problems with John Marshall's court. He was lucky when Marshall died because he puts Taney on the court. For lack of time here, I'm going to jump just to the last thing on here, and that is the reform movements of this last box. This was where we categorized in class. It talks about all the different reforms. We took a matching quiz on this, a little different type of assessment. We talked about Dorothea Dix in mental health institutions. We talked about William Lloyd Garrison and Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass in the introduction of the abolition movement. We talked about the women's suffrage movement, Seneca Falls Convention. That should be on here, but it's not. Oh, it is, thank goodness. In the Seneca Falls Convention with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the Second Great Awakening, which was a religious revival. We talked about how we changed prisons, the Auburn prison system, mental asylums, that was Dix, the temperance movement, the women's Christian temperance movement against alcohol. It would take them 80 years, but they got stuff. Transcendentalism, which was Emerson and Thoreau, the connection of man and nature, That's the 1840s. Transcendentalism. Any questions? That was a lot. Thanks for watching. You're good people. Thanks, Rachel. And others.